Hi everyone, welcome to the 14th episode of the Svarim Chatter series on Sabbetai Zevi. On this episode of this series, I spoke with Dr. David Sclar, and we discussed the Ramchal controversy through Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, which occurred in the early to mid-18th century. Some of what we discussed in this episode was discussed in a previous episode with Dr. Sclar about the Ramchal's life. But in this episode, we went more in depth on the controversy, how it related to Sabbateanism, the Ramchals, and his group Mevakshei Hashem, their outlook on Messianism, and more. I'd like to thank the corporate sponsor of the series once again, Gluck Plumbing. For all your service needs, big or small, in New Jersey, with a full service division from boiler changeouts, main sewer line snakeouts, cameraing main lines, to a simple faucet leak, Gluck Plumbing Service Division has you covered. Give them a call, 732-523-1836, extension 1. That's 732-523-1836, extension 1. And as always, if anyone has any questions, comments, or feedback, or would like to sponsor a show, please email me, svarimchatter@gmail.com. Also, this episode it will be the first episode that will go live with the new Svarim Chatter website, where all the podcasts are. They're searchable. The Sabbetai Zevi series is all together in a drop-down menu. All the tweets from Svarim Chatter are there as well on the website, so check it out. Any feedback, please email me, and the website is svarimchatter.com. Hi everyone, welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter podcast and another episode of the series on Sabbetai Zevi. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Dr. David Sclar once again, and we will be discussing the Ramchal controversy that took place with Moshe Chaim Luzzatto. So thank you, Dr. Sclar, for joining me once again.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Okay, so I first of all mentioned to listeners, about the Ramchal and his whole life, including the controversy we did discuss on a previous episode, which it's in the episodes a while back, but I will put a link to that in the show's notes again, so people can just easily find it. But for this episode, we're going to go a little bit more in depth on the controversy and just to discuss the controversy and how it relates to Sabbateanism and how that all occurred. So let's, I guess, start off again with the controversy. Where did it start and how did this, what year was it and how did it take place?
Okay, so Ramchal, or Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, he lived between 1707, he died in probably 1746, maybe 47. He was clearly exceptional when he was as a young man, and was born to a wealthy family, and he was given all that he really wanted. He pursued his intellectual and ultimately became mystical pursuits. There were reports that by the time he was 14, he was completely a Kabbalist by then, and he memorized, he knew all of the Zohar and the works of the Ari. He had joined a Kabbalistic group that was in Padua, just a small one. It was called Mevakshei Hashem. While he was still an adolescent, he was a teenager. And they studied sort of in an annex or like a room off the main shul of the Ashkenazic synagogue, like off the main sanctuary of the Ashkenazic synagogue in Padua. And at some point in 1727, that was around 1724, 1725, then he started, by the time he was 18 in 1725, he was ordained. He was given smicha. In 1725 or 26, I might be misremembering exactly, the group sort of disbanded as Mevakshei Hashem, and they rejoined, or they reformed in the house of his father, where he was living. And he was essentially at the center. And in 1727, it becomes very sort of focused and messianic. The controversy itself, there's a lot that goes on, and we can come back to this exactly, but the controversy really begins in August 1729. There was an individual named Yekutiel Gordon of Vilna. He'd come from Vilna to Padua to study medicine at the University of Padua. The University of Padua was actually the first university that admitted Jews back in the 13th century, and Jews have been coming, either local Jews already in Padua or elsewhere in the Italian peninsula had been coming and they're studying medicine. Yekutiel Gordon came to Padua in order to study medicine, to become a physician. He meets Ramchal, apparently, probably meets other people first, other mystics, and they connect, and they really become sort of tied together in their mystical and possibly even right from the beginning messianic pursuits. And Yekutiel Gordon ultimately becomes his sort of Ramchal's student, and then even more so, like a disciple. So in August 1729, he sends two letters out. Sends a letter, one back to Vilna, to a rabbi there, and another one, they're almost identical, these letters, and another one he sends to a man named Mordechai Jaffe, who we know of otherwise, to a certain extent, he sort of was mixed up in the Emden Eibeshitz controversy. So when Jaffe gets this letter, I should say that the letters themselves are proclaiming this glorious situation in Padua where there's this young man who seems to be just gifted from God. He has a Magid. This Magid includes basically is this heavenly voice, but he has more than just a Magid, because he can also, apparently, according to as Gordon is writing this, also can meet these the souls of the righteous. That includes Avraham Avinu, and he can meet with I think he refers to Adam Arishon. It's again, I'm sorry if I don't recall, but in addition, he says that Ramchal is the reincarnation of Akiva ben Yosef, Rabbi Akiva. And in describing this, he says to the rabbis who he's sending these letters to, one to Vienna, one to Vilna, this man is astonishing. This young man is astonishing, and he can tell you secrets about your own life, specifically what your own tikkun would be, so to speak. What it seemed is that Gordon was attempting to receive, he was sort of proclaiming this great moment, and he also was hoping to receive some sort of patronage, like, in other words, some sort of support from outside of Padua. Now, locally, they clearly already had some basic support, even more than just basic, because ultimately the group that Ramchal was a part of very much consisted of this new young generation of rabbis there. There was a chief rabbi, and there had been chief rabbis there, but at this time, Luzzatto himself, Ramchal himself, had already been ordained, and there were others as well who would receive smicha. So when Gordon is sending this letter out, it's like this proclamation. He doesn't mention Mashiach per se, and it's unclear as to what the real goal is, but it does seem to me that he's now saying, okay, there's something very special, and I want you to know about it. We don't really know what happens with the letter that goes to Vilna, but Jaffe, basically, Mordechai Jaffe gets this thing, and he sends it off to Moshe Chagiz, who was at that time, that you had Elisha Korlbach on the podcast, so the listeners can hear all about Chagiz, and you can read her book, which is called Pursuit of Heresy. Chagiz was known basically as this heresy hunter. He got this letter from Jaffe, which included a copy of he received a letter directly from Jaffe stating, this is the letter that I got. He got a copy of this thing from Gordon, and he immediately, it raised red flags. This is no good. We've got a young man who evidently is not married, who's 20 at the time. Oh, this is 1729, so actually he's 22, but evidently based on, sort of reconstructing other things, it seems that the Magid arrives in 1727, but in any event, Chagiz finds this to be extremely disturbing and really must be a direct connection to the Messianism and ultimately the Sabbateanism that has persisted. Again, your listeners are going to have lots of people to listen to, but the Sabbatai Tzvi, here you had this great movement in 1665 and 1666, and there'd been great messianic moments, so to speak. But in this particular case, you had this messianism actually persisted and then sort of was reconfigured over time, even after Sabbetai, converted to Islam, and then he died in 1676. So anyway, it persisted, the Sabbateanism, in whatever that form ultimately means, and that's what we can talk about, whatever this term Sabbateanism means. It persisted for decades in like a subterranean type of way, in the underground. And so therefore, when Chagiz hears that there's this young man who claims that he has these heavenly voices and that he can tell people their tikkunim, then this sounds like it's no good, and it's got to be false, and it's got to be something just to be concerned about. Could be a whole new messianic movement, and we don't want to rock the boat, and we don't want to mess with anything. So he writes letters to rabbis in Venice, and he essentially demands that they investigate what's going on in Padua. The reason he writes to Venice is, first of all, because the Venetian Jewish communities, and it's not a single community per se, there are about 5,000 Jews that are living in Venice. They sort of have their multiple synagogues and multiple ethnicities, and it gets complicated here in terms of how we understand community, because you sort of have different ethnicities that have separate charters with the state, with the Venetian state, and they don't all function in a single way, and they don't all function as a united front. And so there's not a single rabbinate per se in Venice, but in any event, Haji sends this letter to, perhaps multiple letters to Venice, saying, you have to investigate Padua. So Venice is this large, involves a much larger Jewish community than in Padua. And the other reason that Venice is seen as, that Haji sees Venice as the one that can investigate is because technically Padua is under the control of the Venetian state, and he assumes that means that the Jews in Padua are under the control of the Venetian Jews. Now, the problem with this is that, practically speaking, when it comes to Jewish communities, no community, at least in this particular instance, I should say, the Padua Jewish community existed as its own polity, its own entity. Venetian Jewry functioned separately, and that meant that basically any Venetian rabbis had no authority in Padua. However, there are deep connections between Venetian Jews and Padua Jews. In fact, Ramchal's father, Yaakov Chai Lutzato, he and his brother had come from Venice. They originally were Venetian, and they had come from Venice to Padua in the 17 teens or something like that. So there was this sort of like rabbinic council or rabbinic commission that was sent to Padua to investigate the situation. And a controversy developed basically over the next several months between the fall of 1729 and then well into the summer of 1730, really investigating what is going on in Padua with this mystical group, some of whom these individuals are rabbis, and they're all young. And what are these reports about Ramchal? Is this true that there's a Maggid? What does it mean? And what are they hoping to accomplish? Should I keep going, or do you want to ask like a follow-up question? I could take this in different directions.
You keep going, but let me just jump in with a couple small comments for the listeners. Maybe I made these in the last episode we did as well. But first of all, so Venice was this kind of Venetian state at the time, and so Padua was part of Venice, this city-state. Something else was also, you mentioned the Lutzatos came from Venice. Reb Simcha Lutzato was in the 17th century, the big Rabbanim in Venice was Lutzato, and also another thing on the Ramchal, you said he wasn't married. He also was clean-shaven as well at the time. I think that was another issue, right? Was he?
So that comes up later. I don't think that when Hajiz first heard of all of this, he didn't know specifics about Ramchal. And in fact, the whole thing about the controversy is that the closer people got to Ramchal, the sort of less concerned they were. It's not always the case exactly, but the biggest outcry took place among specifically Ashkenazic rabbis who were in Central and Eastern Europe, who just heard sort of these unbelievable stories that seemed, and then sort of tied it to, major concerns about Sabbateanism. And they had no way of knowing Ramchal, having any idea who this person was. And so, the controversy sort of became its own, massive problem.
Yeah, so you can take which way you want. I mean, one way I also would say is just to go back. You said Moshe Haji started sending off letters. I mean, who are the other people that are accusing Ramchal, and kind of where does?
Okay, so there are different directions here. Okay, so that's it. The initial point is what takes place where Gordon sends this letter right before Rosh Hashanah, which is probably not coincidental, in 1729. And then Hajiz gets word of it, and he raises this concern, and he wants a sort of like a commission sent from Venice. He wants an investigation. The Venetian rabbis, many of the Venetian rabbis, basically there are a handful who go and they start to investigate. Okay, so who are you? They know the Lutzato family. They know his father. They probably know one of his uncles. They know other uncles in the family because this is a prominent family. They also know the Ramchal's former teacher, Isaiah Bassan, who by then was the rabbi of Reggio Emilia. So this is where it gets a little bit, it starts to get more complicated and also much more interesting relating to exactly what do we mean by Sabbateanism. So we're talking fall 1729 into 1730. Letters are sent around within Italy, within the Italian peninsula, from one community to the next, mainly among the rabbis, trying to figure out who is this guy and how serious is he? Like, what are these claims about a Maggid? Now, first of all, there's a long history of Maggidim, which I think you had Matt Goldish on, and he probably talks about it. In short, you can have, in the early modern period, no one was denying the possibility that somebody could reach some heights where they're going to have some contact with some heavenly voice. I mean, we have this from Yosef Karo most famously, but it goes back earlier than that, and we see it otherwise. It becomes a major problem with Sabbateanism, or with, not so much Sabbateanism itself, but with the Sabbatai Zevi movement in 1665 and 66. And Goldish actually published a book about this, where sort of people who are not, in theory, intellectually or even spiritually capable of attaining such heights are the ones who are actually sort of receiving these quote-unquote prophecies. So the concern here is, if you're hearing about this young man who, as it comes out in the investigation, is not married, doesn't have a beard, because it wasn't popular at the time, so that was that. That somehow he's the one who has a Maggid, this doesn't make a lot of sense. Now, doesn't mean that it's not possible, because, as I said, Ramchal's teacher during the heart of his adolescence, if you're thinking the importance of the time of when you reach the age of bar mitzvah, and his teacher, the chief rabbi of Padua at the time, was Isaiah Bassan. Bassan, who by this time was in Reggio Emilia, he was the son-in-law of Binyamin Cohen Vitale. So Binyamin Cohen had been a student of Moshe Zakut. Zakut was really the major Italian Kabbalist of the second half of the 17th century. Zakut originally had come from a converso family. He had been born, I can't recall actually where he was born, but he lived his early years in Amsterdam, left Amsterdam, went to Poland, I think, for a short time, and then ended up in Venice for many years, and eventually became chief rabbi in Mantua, where he really built his own sort of Kabbalistic movement. At some point I came up with this terminology that keeps going around in my own head, which I've used before, is that he almost cultivates something like Italian Hasidism itself, like an Italian form of Hasidut. I don't mean Eastern European Hasidus, but this importance of Hasidut and this importance of Kabbalah, but bringing it out, almost socially. So in any event, Binyamin Cohen was a student of Zakut. And at this time of Ramchal, and for the decades before that, he'd been known as a Sabbatean. He had been, even with Sabbatai's conversion to Islam and his death, there had been some notion in his mind, and it's difficult to know exactly what it was that he conceived of what it meant that he was continue to believe that Sabbatai Zevi had been the Messiah in one sense or another, but somehow this was the case. But there was something else about relating Binyamin Cohen to Zakut's Chassid, the sort of the Chassidut, that was so important at the time, which was that he was profoundly frum, so to speak. The pietism that Binyamin Cohen, who by now in the 1720s was an old man, that he had been known as this deep pietist, this real Chassid, he was respected intensely, to such a degree that people, the major Rabbanim in Italy would refer to Vitali, when they would, not directly to him, but otherwise when they would write him, they would write about him, they would refer to him as the Kohen Gadol. They would just not say his name. They would say that, Kohen Gadol. So Kohen Gadol. So anyway, these letters now and the investigations about who Ramchal was went basically to Basan and to Vitali. And the interesting thing here about this sort of validity of the possibility that this Maggid could be valid related to, a lot of it came down to how would Basan react and how did Vitali react. Now, in the case of Vital, he himself had been pursuing a Maggid for decades. And his close friend was Avram Ravigo, who I think also Goldish referred to. Ravigo, in his own home, had several people coming through for decades, including at least two people who came through who claimed that they had a Maggid, and Rabigo made a big deal out of this, and they all did. And here, so you had a sort of history where Vitali himself had been working towards this with his own piety and his own pietism, his way of life of pursuing Chassidut, in order, hopefully reaching some level that he could actually have some connection, not just whatever, quote unquote, a general connection to the divine would be, but like an actual integration of communication with some Maggid. We have letters that exist that are between Luzzatto and Vitali that show that they're two generations apart, but that the young man, this young Ramchal, was deeply respectful of Vitali, and vice versa. Vitali looked to Luzzatto as, almost with great hope. So that when we have a letter where it shows that by the time it comes out that Luzzatto is supposed to have a Maggid, Vitali celebrates this. He doesn't seem downtrodden that, oh, I never reached it. He almost seems like, okay, this is from God. Basan, on the other hand, had known this young man since he was a boy, right, a child, and he was much more. He was not deferential in any way, and he really thought that whatever is going on with the young Ramchal and some mystical pursuit, that he was potentially just going down the wrong path, and he certainly shouldn't be opening his mouth about any of this. And in one letter, maybe more than one actually, he refers to the possibility, have you thought, this is Basan writing to this other, have you thought that perhaps the Maggid is actually from the Sitra Achra, meaning is it coming from this sort of source of evil? Rather, it can appear like it's good, but maybe it really isn't. And for you to be proclaiming any of this publicly, this is dangerous news. But from the point of view of the young Luzzatto, the young Ramchal, he probably had a contentious relationship with his teacher anyway. And this can happen for anybody who's an educator, can know that you can have, sometimes your closest students can be the ones who push you the hardest, and you push them, and it can become quite personal. For Ramchal, to hear that Binyamin Cohen, that the elder statesman, that the Kohen Gadol is the one who is supporting him, could have been really the greatest validation he could have possibly hoped for. So there's an internal element that's taking place here for Ramchal, and within this group, there's a group of pietists, because we haven't even really mentioned the other individuals who are involved in Padua itself. And then there's the larger sort of political and social ramifications or the concerns that are taking place, with the correspondence between Hajis and then obviously the rabbis in Benesu. Now, this investigation, there's an actual investigation, sort of by going to Padua and finding out, okay, what is this that what is going on here exactly? There's I should make the point here that, just like I said, that with Venice itself, it wasn't a single community. There wasn't a single rabbinate per se. you have rabbis who are coming down on different sides. Not necessarily that there are Venetian rabbis who are supporting Ramchal himself, but there's like some who are adamantly opposed to what they hear, and there are others who report that they discovered a black candle in the house or in the apartment. They discovered a mirror with a black handle, and that this like these are all things that are supposed to be something demonic. And then there are other rabbis in Venice who sort of just want to, they may not be supportive directly of Ramchal or become, his own disciples, but they would rather not, pursue them in any, concern that this is actually heretical. In any event, there are other people who get involved. Yitzchak Lampronti comes and visits at some point to see. He wrote the great encyclopedia Pachad Yitzchak. He was a rabbi in Ferrara. You have Yosef Ergas, who's in Livorno, who himself had been involved in the suppression of Nehemiah Chayon, I guess a bit more than a decade previously. So Ergas comes and he sees the situation. We have letters from him where he basically just doesn't believe Ramchal. He's not all that concerned, but he sort of says, like, I've seen some of the stuff that he's written, and it doesn't seem all that impressive. It's like, he's more ambivalent about the situation. Also, Lampronti is not all that concerned, but he's also not proclaiming Ramchal as anything all that important. You have this whole range of responses, basically. This is, again, we're dealing specifically in 1730. It ultimately gets to a point where there is enough of a controversy that it becomes very uncomfortable, and comfortable both for Ramchal and his group within Padua, and also uncomfortable for Bassan. Because remember, these are people, there's not a single rabbinate per se, but you have the rabbis work together in many ways. And Bassan sort of is being demanded, there are demands that he answer for his former student. So in 1730, eventually there's sort of an agreement that Ramchal is going to sign an oath stating that he won't write anything else that is that he supposedly gets any additional revelations, quote unquote, that he gets from this Maggid. He won't write these, and he won't publish them, and he won't write in Aramaic, meaning the language of the Zohar. He agrees to this kind of thing. He writes this oath. He signs this oath, and that's supposed to be a sort of the calming effect, and that's the end of it. It doesn't exactly end the internal pursuit of Ramchal and of the group, but it ends what seems to be this initial controversy, where there's a concern, and the concern coming from Chagizan and then certain rabbis in Venice results in basically suppressing their activity, and everybody who's concerned that, okay, this is potentially another Messianic movement, seems to be fine as long as they keep their mouths shut and everything is quiet. And that's what happens by 1730. Why don't you...
Okay, yeah, so we can get to the rest of it probably later, but first of all, for source material, if anyone's interested, I should mention this already now because you've referenced letters. These are all printed, so everyone, you can purchase it in your local farm store, right, in Igros Ramchal, which Machon Ramchal now reprinted the Ginsburg. So there are a lot of these letters from the different Rabbanim. Also, you mentioned Rabbi Yosef Ergas, the author of Shem Ramunim. Or people know Shem Ramunim Akadman. Somehow the Rebbe displaced him. I don't know how that happened, but anyways, so yeah, the big Makumel from Livorno. Okay, so let's probably, you mentioned a couple of Rabbanim, on against him. I don't know if you mentioned those who defended it. We kind of did discuss them. So what were the accusations of Sabbateanism? Like you mentioned, there was this is 50 years, 60 years after Sabbatai Tzvi. What is going on here? What were the accusations here? Before we get to the Messianism, I guess, or maybe that's intertwined here. And then, this also goes together. So just to put this question together is, were they using Sabbatean texts as well at all there?
Okay, so I think there are probably two ways to look at this just to start, in terms of how to present it. The first thing is that none of this is simple in our definition. So let's just deal with, like, was Ramchal familiar with Sabbatean texts? Okay, so the answer is absolutely yes. It's clear. He states this explicitly in letters. These are not letters that are written publicly. It happens to be that the letters that Gordon sent out are among the few that, of all the letters that we actually have, that we can see that were clearly meant for some sort of like greater public knowledge. Most of the letters that we have in the Igros Ramchal, these are, individual letters, and from one to the other. So like Ramchal, you can hear his voice is quite different when he writes to Basan compared to how he writes to, let's say one of the rabbis in Venice or to Livorno or otherwise. So he states, yes, I've looked at Nathan of Gaza, studied the Yehudim, and he basically describes how there's the possibility of, it's like Rabbi Meir and Elisha ben Abuya, like as a way to separate the wheat from the chaff, and identify the actual Torah within it. The context, I think, has to be, I guess, let's start with the second question that would follow this. Do we have to define Ramchal as a Sabbatean in this way? And the answer is not necessarily. Does Sabbateanism mean that he's actually, a follower and believer of Sabbatai Tzvi? Even that has to be defined. Because, and this is where I would really encourage your readers to look deeply at Isaiah Tishby, who spent many, many years studying Ramchal and going very, very deeply into the analysis. Like his articles on Ramchal demand their own many, many years long study. Ramchal developed sort of his own doctrine of the Messiah that was partly based on some sort of doctrines of Messiah that existed within Shabtaut, that had existed within Sabbateanism, that had come from Nathan of Gaza. Basically, any notion for anybody who's imagining, okay, when we pray for Mashiach, we're praying to HaKadosh Baruch Hu that Mashiach will come, that it sort of begins and ends there, it gets so much more complicated. In the case of Ramchal's group, you had a situation where there was an individual in the group who they claimed was Mashiach ben David. His name was Moshe David Valley. Moshe David Valley was 10 years older than Ramchal. He was an established Kabbalist already. He was in Mevakshei Hashem. You remember I mentioned at the beginning that Ramchal, at the age of 14 or whatever, had started joining. He had joined this group Mevakshei Hashem. So Valley already was a deep Kabbalist. And Tishby published stuff, and also there's a scholar in Israel, in the Hebrew University, Yoni Garb, who's published on Moshe David Valley. So here you have in this group, okay, so they say that Moshe David Valley is Mashiach ben David, and then another member of the group, possibly as a Romanin, this other guy who's in Padua, he's a member of the group. He's Mashiach ben Yosef, and then there are other individuals in the group who have these other characteristics, these other roles to play. And you recall that the letter from Gordon claimed that Ramchal was a reincarnation of Kibbutz ben Yosef, and there's a whole bunch of like multiplicity of worlds taking place here, and trying to like ascribe, well, who's got what role, and how does this all work? Ramchal himself is supposed to be supreme in all of this, but if you've got Mashiach ben David already taken and Mashiach ben Yosef already taken, then what's Ramchal? So Ramchal is actually Moshe, as in Moshe Rabbeinu. And Tishby actually shows, and I'm not one to argue with this at all, that at one point it seems clear that Ramchal saw himself as the reincarnation of Moshe Rabbeinu, which is not a coincidence that Gordon says that he's the reincarnation of Kibbutz ben Yosef, if Kibbutz ben Yosef is a reincarnation of Moshe Rabbeinu, anyway. But that at some point there's a switch, and that actually Moshe Chaim Luzzatto becomes like there's the Ibur of Moshe Rabbeinu, like he's the actual is Moshe Rabbeinu. It gets really far out and very complicated. And it gets even more complicated because what Tishby has shown is that when you get into some of Ramchal's texts, written especially in these years of 1729, 1730, Ramchal seems to claim or show that the belief is that Sabbatai Tzvi was Mashiach ben Yosef, that there was this notion that he really was the person at that time who was supposed to be Mashiach, or he's part of this messianic era. And okay, he died because Mashiach ben Yosef is going to die. Now you could also ask the question, well, how can Sabbatai Tzvi be Mashiach ben Yosef, and then they have another member of the group who 2 generations later is Mashiach ben Yosef? But that doesn't really have to be a problem, because Ramchal also writes in a completely separate situation. He writes a letter to Isaiah Bassan, remember his former teacher, that he just realized that Isaiah Bassan is a reincarnation of Akiva ben Yosef. So he can be they both share some reincarnated aspect of Rabbi Akiva. So if that's the case, then you may as well have multiple people who can share something about, some aspect of Mashiach ben Yosef. In any event, with Tishby's work, what's clear here is that, and because he argues it you got to go through it with like a fine-tooth comb here, that Ramchal knows Sabbatean texts extremely well, and he's taking them extremely seriously. As in, it's not just like, okay, I know Kabbalah, and therefore I'm going to know the works of Cordovero and Luria and everybody else, and then Zakut and everything that he did in the 17th century. It's that what Nathan of Gaza offered is legitimate and has to be dealt with. Now, again, it's like defining legitimacy. Does it mean that it's like completely kosher? No, clearly not. But it doesn't mean that it should be denied it's also, I should mention, because of the way you sort of phrase the question, in terms of like, what were they studying? Ramchal clearly is engaged in this. Other members of the group, not necessarily so. And especially after the oath was signed in 1730, the group did not disband. If anything, by 1731, it's pretty clear that it's not that they're stronger per se, but they're like more ensconced. They really never had an issue within Padua itself, because many of them, they all have positions, in terms of being the sons of important figures in the community, and several of the top individuals, Ramchal being one, the Romanin being another, others being having smicha and being sort of the intellectual elite within the community, young intellectual elite, but still there. So the group started to expand, but in like a pyramidal sort of like a hierarchical manner. There are those at the top, Lutzato, Vale, and then there are sort of into second tier, and then there's even a third tier. Anybody who really is interested in joining some greater pietistic pursuit, in this intentional, let's say, this desire to bring about this great unity in the world, which sort of gets its own complicated thing, but how they do it, means anybody can sort of join this yeshiva, chevra, this chevra yeshiva that they have, and those are people who are not going to be involved, have any idea about what's going on in terms of the Shabbatot. Lutzato himself seems to be engaged with this entirely. So then it gets to the question is, well, do we define him as a Sabbateanist or not? But I think the issue here is connecting Ramchal to those who came before him. He, skipping over Bassan a little bit, going back to Binyamin Cohen Vitale, he really sees himself, that is Ramchal, sees himself as the culmination of what's been taking place over the previous few generations. You've got this messianism that is a legitimate messianism that's with Sabbatai Tzvi. You have locally within the Italian peninsula, this entire sort of Italian Hasidism where there's Kabbalah and there's this social consciousness. And by social consciousness, I mean like this goal to bring pietism to a larger population. And you have Messianism all mixed in. So it goes from Zakut to Vitale and, and others as well, to this entire group where Luzzatto is ultimately sees himself as a culmination of this. What that means, I think, is not that it's not about defining whether this person is a Sabbateanist or not. It's rather, internally sort of recognizing that whatever we call Sabbateanism, it is directly, it's ensconced, it's intertwined with everything that we would consider to be quote unquote legitimate Judaism or legitimate. It's, and Vitale is the perfect example for this because it was essentially publicly known that this was a person who still believed that there was something about Sabbatai Tzvi being the Mashiach, but he was also the Kohen Gadol. So what is that exactly supposed to mean? Like, what are we supposed to do with that? Yeah, so I'm not sure how you want to take it from that point.
Okay, I mean, there's a lot there. So I think Tishby, he looks at, a number of Ramchal's writings and things. Maimar Geula is something that he looks at, right? I know he looks at a couple of works. We also should mention, Tishby, so mention this later at the end, but it's in Hebrew and is Native Emunah Minut, and also in English was published as Messianic Mysticism from Lippmann Library. But Meir Ben Yo, noted historian, I think pushes back on some of Tishby's stuff, right? He doesn't agree necessarily with this Sabbatean
right. So
he finds here.
So the Tishby Benayahu relationship seems to have been fascinating, and they have frequently argued with each other in the notes, and not in a nice way. Benayahu, it's like two things about Benayahu. He, with regard to Ramchal, I think he saw himself as sort of like protecting him or like removing any notion of this, Sabbatean red flag, and saying, okay, no, Ramchal was kosher, and that's that. Tishby does not have an agenda in any way that I can see. He reads these things. He read them extremely closely, and he did his analysis. And I think he was he was unhappy that Benayahu sort of seemed to have an agenda of trying to keep Ramchal, to separate Ramchal from any of the Sabbateanism. The other thing about Benayahu, just this is a side note, is that he published so much and he saw so much and knew so much that it's amazing what's out there from Benayahu, but he also didn't really have any particular argument that he was ever making. Tishby clearly was looking at these things, and he was arguing new historical ideas based on the manuscripts that had not previously been looked at. Benayahu generally just would take something and he would publish it so people could see it.
Yeah, and Tishby, like I said, his arguments are really very, very thorough, really busy with the text. Here we're just mentioned like a drop, not, you can look
it's scratching the surface. It's all convoluted also. Like with each of these issues, it's like, you can go down a rabbit hole, but then the whole thing is like turning inside out, and it's very, very complicated.
Right, and then there's also Garb's book, right? Jonathan Garb, Yoni Garb's book as Mikubal B'Lev Asayra, Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, and his biography from Tel Aviv University Press, where he does discuss some of this as well. He mentions the Benio, Tishby, and he kind of gets involved there too. And probably in your dissertation on Ramchal as well. So there's a lot of, this is like all over. So, you mentioned the Messianism. So I think, was this kind of like widely known? Like, did this, or, Ramosha Chaji is sitting there just from what we were discussing in the beginning, where he kind of saw the situation, this young person, and he just kind of just assumed as such that there was Sabbatean issues going on.
Okay, so in the early, so there are two stages. We haven't even gotten to the second stage yet. So the early stage, Chaji is sitting in the triple community of Altona, Hamburg, Wandsbek. So which is known as Ahu. He's sitting there, and there are two other major rabbinic figures that we know of that many of your listeners will have heard of. One is Ezekiel Katzenellenbogen. He published the Sefer Knesset Yechezkel, or he didn't publish. I think it was published after he died. And the other figure is one of the most fascinating people from the early modern period, and that's Yaakov Emden. Chagiz and Katzenellenbogen seem to have gotten along. I mean, Emden, I don't think got along with anybody, but you can ask the experts who really know Emden, about his personality. So when Chagiz was writing to Venice, to the Venetian rabbis in 1729, 1730, Katzenellenbogen was a part of this. Emden, I think, was offended that he wasn't asked to be sort of on, in this early, or let's say united in there as a front, coming from the Drupal community. And in fact, J.J. Schachter has a recent article in the Feshrift for Schneider Lyman about where he's sort of dealing and addresses the fact that Emden and Katzenellenbogen didn't get along at all. Emden insulted lots of people, and he, including Katzenellenbogen. And so, in any event, in that first stage, that's what's happening here. It's primarily, you've got like this sort of Chagiz and Katzenellenbogen front, and then they contacted rabbis in Venice, and there are rabbis in Venice who are then involved, and the oath is signed. Okay. As I said, then it sort of died down in the larger sense, like internationally, so to speak. And then locally within Padua, the Ramchal group, like it continued. And I published an article about the sort of socio-religious aspect of what was taking place internally. Ramchal was interested in, and you can actually see this in all in the works that he published, both during his lifetime and some of the stuff that was published after, where he really is stressing this idea of oneness, that there's God's oneness is the only thing that we can know, and in knowing it, we should actually manifest it in this world. So all that he's doing messianically, so to speak, has to be actually manifested in a public sense. It's not that it happens magically, it's that there seems to be work that can be done, socially in your interactions with other people. And that's the reason he seems to have opened up what was this like Chevra Yeshiva, which initially was like this just small confraternity, this small Chevra, but then became this larger thing. He opened it up where it had multiple sort of, that it was like not just a hierarchy or like a pyramid, but there were these strata. Somebody would come in at whatever level that they came in, and as long as they were completely on board, that's all good. We're not expected, to meet a certain expectation, except that they were engaged in the same pursuit of piety and pietism. So that continued in 1731 and 32 and 33. And then towards the end of 33, Ramchal he attempted to publish a book in Venice. And in a way, publishing anything just got things it just brought things back, meaning he had enemies in Venice. The controversy had actually created a significant problem within Venice among the rabbis, even within the families, in terms of how to address this. And even, like I said before, not everybody actually just supported Ramchal, but sometimes there was the concern was, how do we react? They may not believe that he actually had a Magid, but they're not necessarily going to want to try to suppress all the activity. And this was something that was generally that took place or became much more prominent. This issue of how do we react became much more prominent, with the second round that really took off in 1734 and 35. So basically, Ramchal independently decided, okay, so he was trying to publish something, that's one thing. But independently, he also, and is possibly related to the fact that his father, was in business, was not doing very well in business, had decided that he wanted to leave. He wanted to leave Padua, and he was going to go to Amsterdam. Now, previous to this, Ramchal had written that he wanted to go to Eretz Yisrael, and that probably reflected some, again, this Messianism that was within him. And he already had a brother who was in Amsterdam. So I'm forgetting the dates exactly, but it might have been in January 1734 or something. He decided, okay, he's leaving Padua. Now, this is a major move because of everything that he'd been building within the city. But, for all that he was, and you can see, like, for your listeners who, really want to study Mesilat Yesharim, like, if you really get into it, it stresses humility more than almost anything else. For all his humility, though, he seemed to really have wanted like a greater public recognition. And the other thing to keep in mind is that he was very young at this time. And when you're young, you really want recognition. He left Padua and he started going north. Now, this is like the dead of winter, and he crosses the Alps in the winter. It's, some biographers have seen it as like he's being chased out of Italy. I don't know that he really is, but he definitely, he's had it with something. Like, either there's a significant problem, it could be related to the finances, within the family, but probably less that than he is ready to go off. And he makes his move, going through Central Europe, and we can see how he goes, where he stops on the way, and he ends up in Frankfurt. When he got to Frankfurt, he sought out Yaakov Cohen Poppers. So Yaakov Poppers is known mostly with the RaBaCh of Frankfurt, and the Frankfurt at that time, and large yeshiva, large Jewish community. And Ramchal presents himself, and Poppers has heard of him, and he knows who he is because obviously he knows Chagiz, and Lutzato's name is out there. And it's a question as to, it seems either Ramchal was extremely naive, or he thought that he was charismatic enough that he could sort of change everybody's, he could win everybody over. But Poppers seems to not be impressed, and in their meeting, it turns into like an interrogation, and things go very badly, and it leads to something much worse than sort of like who do you think you are, but rather like Ramchal is condemned yet again. It doesn't seem like he was attempting to do anything in Frankfurt, but Poppers was almost like ready for him, which is a very interesting thing going back to what was happening in 1730, when I said all it seemed to, at least to me, it seems like the rabbis who were concerned, Chagiz specifically, but also in Venice, the concern about what was taking place in Padua, they were, as long as everybody was quiet, then they'd be okay with it. And it's possible that, yes, that's like a superficial way of how things were going. But the moment that there's a move that may upset the status quo, or that somebody is trying to do something else, then that's going to be a problem. So Popper seemed to be ready, and ultimately Ramchal is condemned, and he's forced to sign an oath again, and he ultimately does sign this other oath. He isn't, he doesn't have to, but he chooses to. And there's this big debate ultimately about what to do with everything that he's ever written. Anybody who has any manuscripts, what are we supposed to do with these things? They should just be suppressed entirely. And basically, it's a very long story, but to make it short, these letters, there are letters now that start flying all over Central Europe and Eastern Europe and into Italy about the danger of Ramchal. Ramchal left Frankfurt. This is, again, still 1734. And actually, no, by 1735. And he makes his way to Amsterdam. And he gets to Amsterdam. And once he's in Amsterdam, he's there for 8 years, and things are quiet. But his arrival in Amsterdam he basically arrived and lived among Portuguese Jews there who had very little to do with anything, with any Jews who were, Ashkenazic Jews who were in Central and Eastern Europe. His life continues off in that direction in sort of a quiet way. And between 1735 and 1736, there are many, many letters that are spread throughout Europe denouncing Ramchal. And ultimately, there are at least 11 bans that are sent. And each of the bans reflects sort of the concerns of the particular rabbi, depending on where they are. Again, like I said at the beginning, then most, if not all, the individuals that we're talking about, except with the exception maybe of Venice itself, some of the rabbis in Venice, most had no connection to Ramchal, not even a connection to a connection, so to speak. And they were just sort of one following a previous ban, and yet each one sort of reflected the particular concerns of whomever authored it. So you have bans that are brutal, that like Eliezer Rokeach, who's talking about, that they can refer to like a ban in this lifetime and the afterlife, and you have others that extend to those who are part of the group in Padua. You have others that are less intense. You have others that are referred to a ban on Kabbalah. Then there's like a clear sort of disagreements in terms of like when it comes to the study of Kabbalah, which seemed to be, for those who were sort of looking back to what is the origin of this entire issue, there were many rabbis who then were saying, no, you can't go so far as to ban Kabbalah, the study of Kabbalah, because, then you're essentially just suppressing an entire aspect of what we do and what the truth is and that sort of thing. This becomes a larger discussion in the Italian Peninsula specifically, and Bassan gets involved, and so does Samson Morpurgo, who's the rabbi in Ancona, basically getting into this whole thing of, where I mentioned this Italian Hasidism and this pietism that had spread for several generations. Morpurgo basically says, we have like 3 or 4 generations of what's been developing here, more and more and more, and we have to accept it. And he even makes this analogy of, accepting that, like when Bnei Israel were entering the land of Israel, so you have 2.5 tribes that stay on the east part of the river. So like, that wasn't the original, that was not the mitzvah, that's not the commandment initially, but that's what happens, and then we have to accept it. Moshe Rabbeinu had to accept it. So it's a similar issue, at least as Morpurgo presents it. And so we have to understand, okay, we're gonna respect the fact that there are more and more pietistic groups that are in Italy, and so, and understand the context from which Ramchal was coming from. Ultimately, many of his, some of the bans refer, one actually in particular, coming out of Venice, from a rabbi named Isaac Pacifico, said something to the effect that he gave like a certain number, I think it was like 2 weeks, that all Jews and men and women, anybody who has anything belonging or any copy of something of Ramchal's work has to turn it in within this time period, otherwise they'll fall under this ban. And ultimately, the discussion related to what had taken place in Frankfurt with this sort of Inquisition, or there's this experience that Ramchal had on the way to Amsterdam. The issue came to, well, once we've confiscated all of his all these manuscripts, what do we do with them? Do we burn them or do we bury them? And Morpurgo sort of he arranged ultimately that, let's not be so extreme and burn. We don't want to burn these things, but we'll bury them. But ultimately, it led to the suppression of Ramchal's early activity.
So getting back to the Sabbatean part, now that's kind of like the end of the controversy and the end of his life, we kind of discussed in the previous episode. But getting back to the Sabbatean part, so he writes a work against Sabbateanism, right? Kinas Hashem Tzvakas. And what's the story with that? Is he writing it just to deflect? Was he writing it for like other
I mean,
what's
I
the
think
story with
it's so he wrote this. He didn't convince many people, it seems. It wasn't published during his lifetime. You know, he wrote a lot. He wrote constantly. And he may have written this as not as a deflection, but as sort of, some sort of defense. But, even in the defense, he's not, we're talking about somebody who really probably believed that Sabbatai Tzvi had been the Mashiach ben Yosef. But he can't say that. And he can't try to explain the nuance of what that's supposed to mean, because he can't even explain what it means that there's maybe sitting in his yeshiva, not even in the yeshiva part, but in like the chevra, like in the, in the small group, maybe he could explain, okay, well, this is what Mashiach ben David is, and Mashiach ben Yosef, and how he's Moshe Rabbeinu. But like, you can't do that in a book, in a sefer, and especially to people who have it out for you. So, that's sort of the problem of, this is just a general problem. It doesn't have to just be within controversy, but like when there's an argument, and if you're not on the same page about trying to actually come to a resolution, and here this is just an accusation that he has to defend himself, there's not really a good way to defend. He couldn't really defend himself on the issue of the Magid. Like, this is what he claimed. He claimed that he had a Magid and that he had all the, and he didn't. He just continued to argue that until eventually he just stopped talking about it. And by the time he's in Amsterdam, and even a couple of years before that, there's no mention of it. So like, it's not clear as to what's going on internally at that point either. With the Shabtaut stuff, like, he just sort of seems to want to leave it aside, because it's not going to do him any good, and he's not able to really address it. But if we look, to me, it's sort of like looking at this very carefully and saying, okay, there's like an inner life and an outer life. How he ultimately, presents himself, distinct from what he is personally living. And we did, I think we talked about this at the end, like, and when we first spoke, he eventually left Amsterdam. He'd been living well. And he left Amsterdam. He went to Eretz Yisrael, because he had been it was clearly in pursuit of something that was still within him. But at that point, it's not quote unquote Sabbatean, and he's completely removed from the Italian context. And Vitali, I should have mentioned, Benjamin Cohen Vitali died in 1730. So these later years, the second round of the controversy, don't even involve him. And the biggest support that Ramchal that he had isn't even there anymore.
So does a lot of this, kind of what you're saying is, with the Sabbateanism here, it gets getting back to that question of, what is Sabbateanism exactly 50, 60 years after Sabbatai Tzvi? That's kind of what does it mean here? What's the belief? Like, what's going on?
Yeah, so it's not easy. Historiographically, historians generally can refer to Sabbateanism as this sort of, it's an umbrella term that's going to refer to something related to the initial messianic movement that, of Sabbatai Tzvi in 1665 and 66. But what you see with the Ma'aminim, like the Donme, in the Ottoman Empire, or what you see with the Frankists, those two groups are, the question is what connects them? Like the name of somebody, Sabbatai Tzvi, and that's it. Like it's a hard sell. And in the case of Ramchal, he's somebody who was he looked at Nathan of Gaza's text. He took it seriously, I think, because of the scenario being that he was introduced to Kabbalah probably through Bassan. And then Bassan's father-in-law was, Binyamin Cohen. So, and who was a Sabbateanist, in the sense that he really did believe something about Sabbatai Tzvi. The question exactly means what? I know that Matt Goldish on one of the episodes that he was on with you referred to, that supposedly that he had that Vitali had a portrait of Sabbatai Tzvi hanging. I mean, you could ask a lot of questions about what it means when we have portraits up, and especially in this day and age. Anyway, yeah. So at the time, you can also ask the question about like, what did Sabbatianism mean? Hajiz, he didn't know about Ramchal's messianic doctrine per se. Tishby actually refers to that. He didn't have any reason to, he wasn't assuming, for instance, that Ramchal believed that Sabbatai Tzvi was the Mashiach. Like, not initially. He didn't necessarily think, he just knew that this was a problem. In his mind, this is a problem. There's a 20-year-old kid who says that he has a Magid. And that whole thing is tied at that time. It's all mixed in. Kabbalah and this notion that this Magid is tied into this sort of umbrella term that we're calling Sabbatianism.
Right. Yes, I mean, this is all a part of it. Another thing, I mean, from now is a good time to mention. I don't think we mentioned it originally, especially, but it's interesting now, especially with the new publication of the 2 new editions of Magal Tov of the Chida. The Chida's kind of relationship, Ramchal is weird. I mean, he kind of mentions all of the Sabbateans, in Shem HaGdolim and in Magal Tov, Shmuel Primo is mentioned, and Vitali is mentioned. I think of Rovigo also. I mean, he alludes to RaBaCh. He mentions, I think, Sabbatianism. There's Sabbatean, the comments that he makes in there. I saw recently, but Ramchal is kuf flutzato, and like he doesn't mention his works. He doesn't mention him. Like he's just. Like he's like the one person that gets just like deleted of all his svarim, but while he mentions Sabbateans, doesn't mind talking about them. Do you have like what's the
that's interesting. I don't know, his opinion on Ramchal is curious to me, because he does mention that he mentioned something about having he either met, I'm now forgetting the dates of everything. He either met or he heard a story about what Yaakov Chazak was a Forte is his name. So he was part of this original group. He was older than Ramchal, and he became a major posek in during his time, in Italy, and so Chida quotes something from Chazak about Ramchal and about the Magid, but he doesn't engage with him. So, and why that is, I don't know. It could be almost coincidental. I'm not really sure. I mean, in the sense of what is Ramchal in Padua, and the opinions about him in the latter, let's say in the second half of the 18th century. He never went back. His parents left. He had siblings, but at least 2 of them, it seems, went to Amsterdam with him, or at some point. And, we get in the early 19th century, in the first half of the 19th century, we have the rabbi of Padua, Mordechai Shmuel Gerondi, who seems to be going out of his way to rehabilitate Ramchal. So it's possible that by the time Chida is coming through, that there's not a lot to say, but I'm not really sure why that is or how that is.
Right, actually, yeah. And Mordechai Shmuel Gerondi, who I told you before the episode in the Minhag Nazim, the 13th volume of Avshalom's journal. So there's a whole article about his history work, Sefer Toldos Gedolei Yisrael V'Goynei Italia, and which is kind of a combination of his work and Hanan al-Nepi's work. So on the part on Ramchal, it seems like as they put it together, he kind of changed things around there. He portrays it as Nepi and him, and this is accurate, but the way that Rav Moshe Hillel, Yaakov Hillel's son, shows it, he kind of changed it to make it, like you said, he was very involved with rehabilitating Ramchal's image. It's seemingly
right. So it could be that in those decades after Ramchal left Padua and died. I mean, he died young. He wasn't even 40. that there was still something negative hanging over, or that simply there wasn't that much to be said about him at the time. And the stuff that he published during his lifetime was mainly in Amsterdam. Like Messiah Sharim was published in Amsterdam.
Right. I can read so what it says from the Makar from Chanel Nepi here. I read it to you before. I can read it here.
Yeah.
I mean, he says he's quoting this. It's on page Tzadi in the Menagnazim. He says Shashama meish nemon shekashameis harav lutzato hanal ba'ako harav malachi toyrich atzme lalicha l'eretz Yisrael l'kaver sham mipnei shehikr by shemeis nichna ma'oid bal tshuva gemura. This is not in the Mordechai Shmuel Gerandi. He does not say this. He brings this story. This Rabbi Malachi he lo shenimtza ba'akik shenifta Rav Lutzato says Shashimash ezi yam u'kaydim p'turas yomotza anav ma'oid u'b'shvil ze tarich atzme licha l'kaver Eretz Yisrael ziyah. Then he goes on, and after you print this, he leaves out that whole part. And there's more here that he clearly changes up. And this is one of the examples they're just showing. And this is about the Mordechai Shmuel Garandi's famous history work. I'm just cherry picking one piece that they talk about. So, I mean, in summation, the Ramchal. So it's kind of a complicated parsha here.
Extremely.
Simple answer. We're not trying to give simple answers, and also for listeners, we're not trying to paint Ramchal as a Sabbatean either. That is not the point of the podcast. It's not, it's not what I'm saying, and I don't think, what you're saying. It's not simple.
I think the point. I guess there are 2 points. I guess that I would want to make. One is I don't know that it's helpful to imagine, to make a claim, looking back, like, oh, okay, was Ramchal Sabbatean or not? The point here is that it's clear that he was fully aware and deeply connected, but he was developing his own theology and his own complicated theology, so complicated that it's not like, oh, okay, it fits into whatever we assume is, has always been the Masorah. Like, even just this Messianic doctrine is so complicated that it's not just so, it's just not simple. That's one thing. And the other thing is that it complicates, I think I mentioned this at the very beginning, like it complicates our notions of the community and also of quote unquote the rabbinate. Like, it's not a single thing. There's not a single Jewish community. There's real complexity here in terms of how communities are interacting and how the individuals are interacting, how the rabbis are interacting. The whole point ultimately, which I'm not even sure that I stressed at all in this, is that you really have a rabbinic controversy. It's not even a Sabbatean controversy per se. Ramchal himself was a rabbi. Moshe David Valley, Isaiah Romanin, Yaakov Chazak, they were all rabbis. They are the rabbinate of Padua. We're missing the chief rabbi, who was he was in another generation, Sabbetai Marini, but his son, Marini, he was a chief rabbi of Padua after Basan left, his son was part of the Ramchal group. Like, we're talking really that this is, if Chajis or even the rabbis in Venice, there are rabbis in Venice who are wanting to suppress all of this. Who are they trying to suppress? Other rabbis? So, like, and the whole thing with Vitali is a perfect example. Here's a person who's so respected and so highly regarded because of his piety that people accept it as Sabbateanism. And especially if it didn't have anything to do, like, it didn't manifest itself in any particular way. Just meant that he believed something. Question is, what did he believe? Now, for somebody like Moshe Chajiz or then Yaakov Emden, these things really, really mattered. And then maybe that gets into a whole Emden Eibschitz thing, like, exactly, like, well, fine. So we are talking about rabbis, and if they believe something else, then none of this is kosher. What are we doing exactly? But in any event, really a lot of it gets down to, like, how do you define something, and what sort of questions are we really asking here?
Okay, right, absolutely. So what? In conclusion here, I guess, what reading would you recommend about this whole Ramchal issue if people want to read it?
For I would say that for to get a basic understanding of what took place with the actual controversy, then you look at Elisheva Carlebach's book, Pursuit of Heresy. She's got 2 chapters in there in the Ramchal controversy. That's a biography of Chagiz, but mainly about the biography in the context of his Sabbatean pursuit, so to speak. So that's the first thing. If you really want to get deep, but you have to really learn to get into like what's happening, on a deeper level in terms of what the Ramchal was thinking, then you really look at Tishby's work on Ramchal, and he published many articles, some of which were translated. Probably the most important ones were translated into English. And I'm going to have an article that'll come out in I don't know when, a year or two, on the controversy. And Yoni Garb has a book that he deals quite a bit with the controversy. And he takes that and, the importance of it in Ramchal's theology. And that's really probably where I would start.
And the letters, would you suggest?
Oh, and then the letters are amazing, actually. I should have mentioned this before. So the letters they're more than 160 extant letters to, from, and about Ramchal. They were published initially, the bulk of them, about 100, I don't remember exactly the number, maybe 150 of them were published by Simon Ginsberg in 1931 or something like that, in 2 volumes. He wrote Ramchal. And then, 15 years ago or something, or 20 years ago, Mordechai Shriki, who founded Machon Ramchal, he republished the letters, which is a better edition. It's more readable, and he also has notes, and it's very, very helpful. He included some stuff that Ginsberg didn't have. I would only mention one other thing, is that it was really one of the great scholars of early modern Jewish history, was Elliot Horowitz. And he passed away a few years ago. He wrote fantastic articles. Each one was just hugely influential, and was a fascinating character. And I remember he told me something at one point where the thing that got him into early modern Jewish history, that made him want to be a historian of early modern Jewry, was reading these letters from, these Igrot Ramchal, because they just tell a story that is fascinating, about fascinating characters, some of whom your listeners will have heard of and learned, something from them. But you really get into personalities, and these are fascinating and deep and contemplative personalities. So, I would definitely go there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll link, a couple of these things, and like I said, this is a complex thing, I know. And we mentioned here as well that even amongst scholars, there's kind of, you mentioned the Benio and Tishby, and I think when I had on Professor Elisheva Carlebach, I think she emphatically endorsed Ramchal against any of the accusations. So I know there's it's not clear, and we just try to hopefully tell people about the controversy and how it was. And like I said, the letters are so fascinating, because you can actually read a lot of the source material, a lot of those letters that were published from manuscripts. So I'll try to find the link there. It's available in Farm Stores. I'll try to. I know it's available. It's around $30
for sure. Even if you can't find it in this farm sale, I'm
saying in any farm store in general, it's widely available. And I'll put a link. I'll try to find a link somewhere for it to put in the show.
The other thing just to mention is that Machon Ramchal really, they're publishing regularly. Stuff from Ramchal. Mordechai Shriki has made it his mission, his life's work, to really just promote Ramchal, and they do a tremendous amount.
Yeah. Okay. So with that, thank you for joining me once again to discuss Ramchal.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.